Hello everybody, I want to welcome you to our workshop, The Art of Digital Nature Photography. We're going to have a great time here looking at some pictures and talking about photography fundamentals, including cameras and lenses and exposure, lighting, and so on before heading out to capture some great photography. So once again, I want to welcome you all and let's get started. My name is Charlie Borland, and I've been photographing for over 35 years, and I've done a lot of things in my career, including commercial photography and corporate travel, even some industrial and product photography. But I've also done a tremendous amount of outdoor, landscape, and adventure photography for a wide range of clients, as well as quite a few magazines. And while I enjoyed all of it, it's true that my passion lies with landscape and adventure photography and traveling around. So when I wasn't off doing assignments for some of my clients and getting paid good money, I was off photographing the outdoors, and I've traveled the entire United States several times, photographing in every state, which includes landscapes and city skylines and parks and so on. I've also been fortunate enough to shoot a lot of rafting trips like the Grand Canyon and the Copper River in Alaska, some of those on assignment. And also, I spent a lot of time taking people outdoors and photographing them doing various adventure activities and so on. So I have a deep and undying passion for the landscape, nature, and adventure, and just love being out there. So I'm going to share with you during this class a lot of the things that I've done that allowed me to really capture quite a catalog of good photography. So to start, here's where you can find me. BorlandPhoto.com is my website. You can find my contact info if you feel a need to get in touch with me. I also have a website called GreatPhotographyCourses.net. And here's where I basically just create various types of training and so on. And it's basically, you can learn the business of outdoor and nature photography or flash photography or portrait photography or anything like that. So I won't talk much about that, but you just go to GreatPhotographyCourses.net. And if you see a class that interests you, just use the coupon code SAVE50 and you'll get it for half price. So now let's look at some nature photography. What we're going to talk about again, as I just mentioned, is exposure and composition and lighting and so on, how you can go out and really embrace your environment and search for that great shot. So I'm hoping the tips that we're about to cover here are going to help you achieve exactly that. So the first thing we're going to talk about here is cameras. What type of camera should you get? Well, you probably already have a camera, and if you're here, again, you probably already bought one, so there's no need for me to really tell you a whole lot about buying a camera. So I'm just going to go ahead and cover a couple of the little highlights that I think are important to a good camera for landscape and nature photography, in case you just happen to be in the market to find another one. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is the camera. Now, you've probably already shown up with your own camera, so there's not really much need for me to tell you what to get. If you're out shopping for another camera or about to get your first camera, you're here because you already have a camera and you want to get out and photograph. But there's a few things, just in case you're going to shop around, that I think you might want to consider. And I believe that you want to get a camera that has the highest possible resolution for your goals. My two cameras are over 20 megapixels at the moment. And this is great for a lot of the photography that I do that might be used for publication. Now, magazines, brochures, and that type of thing are really starting to lose ground to the internet, and subsequently most photography ends up being pretty much placed on the internet for viewing, and as such you don't need a super high resolution camera if that's really going to be your only goal. Now, on the other hand, you may have no interest in presenting your work in that capacity, but maybe you want to make giant prints. Again, the highest resolution is going to give you a bigger print. Small resolution or low resolution is not going to give you as big of a print as a high resolution. For example, a 10 megapixel digital file being turned into a print will only go so big, where a 20 megapixel resolution will go a lot higher. So again, get the camera or use the camera that's going to meet your goals. Depth of field preview button, I think, can be really handy. Allows you to look through the camera, press the button, and then pretty much see what your scene is and how much depth of field you have. So we got more of that coming up. A cable release socket is great. As far as I know, almost all cameras come with those. In fact, I can't think of one that doesn't. A hot shoe is pretty nice if you plan to do flash photography, but as you probably know, some of these higher-end digital cameras don't have hot shoes for a flash, so that can prevent some challenges. So again, you have to decide if that's something you're going to need. And then something that's probably not so important is a PC socket. If you want to be a professional or work as a professional and use lighting, then a PC socket's what you plug your strobe light sync cord into to make it fire. If you don't have that, not a big deal. There's lots of other options. Now the next thing is sensor size, and here's kind of a diagram I found online just to kind of give you an idea. If you look at the white line on the outside, which is this area here, this is a full frame sensor in a digital SLR. And then if you look at the red line, it's a 1.6 crop factor. That's pretty common now. I don't really pay that much attention to gear, so it's really going to be hard for me to tell you that a certain camera has, like the 1.3 sensor. Most of them are about 1.5, 1.6. Both of my Canons, or I should say one of my Canons, the 6D, is a full frame. The other camera is a 70D, and it's a crop sensor. And so I like having both types of cameras because I get more mileage out of my lenses. So that's kind of important, and I'll address that coming up as well. Now, if you look at this shot, here is one reason I like having a full frame and a cropped frame sensor. This is the same 300 millimeter lens on my Canon 5D when I took the picture here, and my Canon 40D. So the crop sensor basically makes my 300 millimeter lens closer to something like closer to something like 450, 460 millimeters. So I'm getting more mileage out of my lenses by having two different cameras. And so that's a pretty good thing, something to consider. The other thing to think about is lenses, and just a quick recap here is to mention the speed of a lens and what it means. Now, f2, there's lenses that have wider apertures than f2, but an f2 is considered a super fast lens, whereas an f2.8 is much more common and it's considered a fast lens. An f4 lens is considered average, but once you get to 5.6 or 6.3 lenses, then they really are considered to be slow. So what do I mean by this? Well, the wider your base aperture is, or I should say really the wider that your widest aperture is, the more light can come in and allow a faster shutter speed. So here's an example. I've got f2.8 at 1/60th ISO 100. If that's what the meter said with my f2.8 lens. But if I put on an f4 to an f5.6, the shutter becomes 1/15th to 1/30th because less light is coming in, so you get a slower shutter speed. So really your only choice in cases like this is to increase the ISO to get to a shutter speed back up where you can continue to hand hold. Now, is this important? It may or it may not be. The reason I say that is if you have a tripod and you're shooting, you don't care that you're at 1/15th or 1/30th or even longer, and you're on a tripod, no worries. But if you're shooting anything handheld, you're in Yellowstone as an example, and there's some elk walking across the meadow, and it's early in the morning, the light's not super bright, you quickly grab your 300 millimeter lens, put it on your camera, and start and aim it at the elk. You might have too slow of a shutter speed to actually get sharp pictures, so you have to really increase your ISO to bring that shutter speed up. And then of course the higher ISO, the higher level of noise in your picture and that sort of thing. So there's trade-offs for the most part, but that's what fast lenses or slow lenses really encompass. And it's kind of important to have a good understanding of that when you are shopping for lenses maybe down the road. So now on the next thing here, let's just take a quick look at what you get with a variety of lenses. Now I can tell you right now, I have 17 to 35 Canon lens, which is the older version of the 16 to 35. Love it. Still tack sharp after all these years. I have a 28 to 70, I have an 80 to 200, and I have a 300. All of those lenses except the 300 are f2.8, meaning they're very fast. But because they're f2.8s, they're bigger, they're bulkier, and they're heavier. And so that's something to consider. If you don't want to carry around the weight, look for the slower but lighter lenses. And I don't really have any recommendations because I'm not in the market to look for them, but it's an option for you to lighten your load a little bit if you need to. So this is a perspective at 17 millimeters. So let's just cycle through these to show you what you get as you continue to change your focal length. So here we're at 24, and now we're at 35. So here we are at 50 millimeter lens. Then we're at 90, as you can see, slowly zooming in on this boat here. 120, 200 millimeters, and 300. So you can kind of see what I got going from 17 millimeters to 300 millimeters with just a couple lenses, 4 different lenses to get to that. But gives you an idea of, here's the lens for the elk and the 17 millimeter. The first picture is the lens for the really wide landscapes. So kind of gives you an idea what you get with different perspectives. So one of the things that also comes with your camera is different metering modes, and this is how your camera reads the scene and makes a determination on the exposure that it's either going to use, like if you're in aperture priority, or the exposure combination that it's recommending if you're in manual exposure mode. And the first one is evaluative, which is really kind of a general purpose type of a metering. It meters pretty much the whole scene, but in different amounts. And your manual is probably the best place to kind of get an idea of just where it meters and how it works. Then the next one is center weighted, which kind of averages with the rest of the scene. And then partial metering meters the viewfinder center only. So this is good for backlighting when you're doing people and stuff like that. And then spot metering for metering a very small area. That black circle in the middle is the only place that the camera is going to actually meter. So you're going to want to hit it on the good spot. You're going to want to place that black circle on the best spot that you consider to be average in tone to get a good exposure. And it's a little more complex than that. So to give you an idea, here's a good example of using the evaluative metering mode for a scene that's, pretty much got average tones. There's whites and there's darks and so on, and the exposure is good. But here's another scene where, as you can see, my camera's seeing the shadow side of this giant rock, which is framing the other rock. And if I was to use the average metering, the exposure would be way off. The rock in the distance would be well overexposed, which would also bring detail under the rock, but I don't really want that. I want the underside of the rock just like it is here, which is really dark. But the way you'd use the spot metering here is you would put that on the rock in the distance that's got the sunlight on it, let it take a meter reading there, set that as your aperture, and then you're done. You'd get this dark area under the rock. Maybe there'd be detail or maybe not, but that's how you would want to use spot metering, where it just goes in and selects a specific area. Now, a lot of times, I shouldn't say a lot of times, I have had students in my courses and workshops before tell me that the camera store salesperson told them to use spot metering for all their work, and they're coming out with these disastrous exposure results. My recommendation is you just use the evaluative and you don't use anything else. Why? Because it's all about the histogram when it comes to determining the best exposure. If you're not sure about that, hold on, because I've got that coming up and I'll tell you about it. The next thing is image resolution. If your camera is capable of creating a 50 megabyte file, using 20 plus megapixel setting on your camera, you might as well use that. The reason is you just never know what's going to happen. Somebody might see your picture on Facebook. Let's say an advertiser sees your picture on Facebook or Google Plus or somewhere in social media and gets in touch and says, we love that. We want to use that for an advertisement. We're going to pay you $1,000. Now, you might be thinking that's nuts, but it does happen. I have students contact me from time to time telling me that's exactly what happened. This is why social media is so important to professional photographers trying to make money, is these things do happen. But if you shot this at the lowest resolution of your camera, you're not going to make the sale unless it's a web-based sale, meaning they just need an image for the web. But when I'm sending photos off to clients, rarely are they asking me for a low res, they're asking me for the highest res. So keep that in mind. You might as well shoot it at your highest resolution, then get rid of the pictures you don't need, or the bad ones, just so you're saving hard drive space. Okay, and next thing to consider here is what color space do you want to set for your camera? And these are all in the menus. So here's a rough overview, and then I'll sort of tell you what I do. sRGB is really the best for on-screen web-based images. In fact, a lot of times I will change the color well, let me stop for a second and go back and say that I don't use sRGB. My camera is set to use Adobe RGB because it captures a vast amount more in color tones. And that's important for me as a professional. Now, sRGB is good for printing, but no print can really print color greater than an sRGB. But apparently, I've been saying that for years until my friend Lewis Kemper said, that's a lie. They now can print pictures that has the range of colors that are Adobe 1998 or higher. So I can't even say that anymore. So sRGB is basically great for the web. Adobe 1998 is better for reproduction. Again, you're going to get a magazine cover, a brochure. You don't know what's going to happen, but you might as well shoot the color profile that gives you the most information. You can always downsize to sRGB and take an Adobe 1998 and convert it to an sRGB and then put it on the web. And that is what I recommend you do. Now, this color space thing, what's important to know is if you shoot RAW files, it doesn't really matter what your color space is because a RAW file pretty much captures everything in great detail. So this thing about color space that you set in your camera is only really effective for your JPEGs. And if you followed my advice, don't shoot JPEGs, shoot RAW, or shoot both JPEGs and RAW. And then convert to sRGB if you're going to put things on the web. Now, another thing that's important here is white balance. So I'm going to start off this time by telling you right off the bat, if you shoot RAW, the white balance in your camera doesn't matter. However, I still pay great attention to the white balance settings in my camera, and the reason is I want my JPEGs to be right on the money too, just in case I need those. The other thing is, if you go out and you shoot something and it's got a beautiful, unique color, how do you know exactly what that color is? If you take only a RAW file, you only use RAW, for example, and then you go in, you go in and you shoot it as shot, or you use auto white balance on accident or whatever, how do you know what was the great color? So again, choosing the right white balance isn't that big of a deal and not really that time consuming, but I think it's important that you understand exactly how it works. Manual white balance means you set the color temperature in the menu. And I used to use this a lot when I was doing commercial photography. I'd go into inside somewhere, let's say a manufacturing plant. I had a color meter and I would measure the color temperature inside there. Then I would set that on the camera. The other thing is, and that would work good for getting good color in there. But now auto white balance basically averages all the colors and it creates compromises. And again, this is great for indoor use, when you have a lot of mixed lighting, let the camera go ahead and decide, and then you can learn later on how to adjust various regions of your photograph that might be off color. It's really pretty easy to do. Then you have your presets. Tungsten, which is your indoor lamps, 3200K. Fluorescent, we know what fluorescent light bulbs look like. If they are the green fluorescence, then they're about 4000 Kelvin. Daylight is traditionally 5500K, although some people say 5200K. Anywhere in there is what the color daylight is. Flash is around 5900K. Cloudy, 6000 to 6200. And then shade, which is very, very blue in color, is 7,000 or a little higher. So, this is important too, to understand these. If you're going to be shooting indoors and you're going to be using JPEG, you might want to set to one of these preset white balances that matches the indoor lighting, and then you'll get really good neutral color, no color shifts. If you don't know, or if the lighting is mixed, like you got fluorescent, you got some tungsten, and you got some window light, just use auto white balance. That's the best compromise. And learn to basically use color correction techniques in Photoshop or Lightroom. Now, one of the things about outdoor and nature photography, which is why we're here today, is you want to use the proper white balance. And so here is an example of manual white balance, 5500K, and auto white balance, which I didn't record what the camera chose for auto white balance. But you notice, this is at sunrise, that the picture on the left is warmer in color. Well, this is important to understand. If you use auto white balance, its job is to take color shifts, and sunset lighting and sunrise lighting are very warm, but these are not neutral colors. They're warm colors. They're more like that lamp in the living room, tungsten colored. So auto white balance's job is to eliminate that color shift, except in my opinion, that ruins your landscape photography. So my recommendation is to leave your camera manually set to daylight at around 5500K or cloudy, which is around 6000 to 6200, and you'll be a lot happier with the results. Here's another example of auto white balance versus manual white balance. The sun is setting. You can see how warm it is on the left, but when I used auto white balance, it eliminated a lot of that warmth. So that's kind of important. So what about recording formats? All right, well, every camera that I know of comes with JPEG and RAW. And JPEG is a lossy format. That means every time you open up that image and you do something to it in Photoshop or image processing software, you then save it, you lose some of the data. I've heard as much as 30% of data gets thrown away while it compresses the file when it's saving it. The advantage of JPEG is you can get more images on your card, your flash card or your SD card, and JPEG is also what you want to use because it is small files when compressed for emailing. But if you accidentally, let me back up here. If you shot RAW, everything's good. If you accidentally shot all JPEGs and you want to preserve the maximum quality, then as soon as you realize that, open up the JPEG, do what you want to do to it, then save it as a TIFF. Don't save it as a JPEG. That way you'll still have your original JPEG that you can go back, but you'll have a TIFF which doesn't compress and doesn't really, well, I should say there is some compression available for TIFF, but it doesn't throw away the amount of data that a JPEG file does. So something to keep in mind. What about a RAW file? Okay, well, the RAW file is what I often call the unprocessed roll of negatives. It's basically untouched. When you process the negative film at the photo lab, it's developing it, and that's what you do with a RAW file. You go develop it. The good part about a RAW file is you can't turn around and save the RAW file and overwrite it. You'll always have that image information available for you to go back anytime and change things. So that's huge in my opinion. Again, the RAW file has substantial amounts of data, and that's why we want to really use it for our landscape photography. The thing is, though, when you got RAW, you need software to process that RAW file. And a lot of times there's software that comes with your camera, or you can go to Adobe or On1 software or any of the others that are making image processing software and get what you need to process your files. Again, once you process your RAW file, then you save it as a JPEG or a TIFF or whatever Photoshop document, whatever you want to save it, so you'll still always have your original file. Now, the camera that you're using, it will process the JPEG files right in your camera, and that's why it has these settings that you can pick, like portrait, landscape, so on. These only affect the JPEG that you shoot in your camera. And I do shoot RAW and JPEG side by side a lot, but I do find most of the time I eventually throw away all the JPEGs and just keep the RAWs. And if you want to see the difference here, these are petroglyphs on a sandstone wall. The left image is the RAW picture, not processed. The right image is the JPEG file processed by the camera. And you can see it added contrast, it added color saturation, and so on. Sometimes that's not bad, but again, having a RAW to work with down the road is really, really going to be an advantage with your photography. So just to give you an idea, I keep talking about RAW, why you want to shoot RAW, and the simple reason is there's just a vast amount more of information to work with. And here's a little chart. An 8-bit JPEG has 256 colors per channel, a 12-bit RAW, 4,096, a 14-bit RAW, 16,384 colors per channel. So that's huge. That's huge. And I'm not going to dig too deep into this technical subject, but I'm just trying to convince you that you really want to shoot RAW. And I'll bet you already all are. So it's a moot point, I guess. So, okay, let's talk about some other equipment that is very useful to have in the camera bag. And one is a polarizing filter. What this does is it polarizes the light that's hitting your subject. And essentially what that means is it's removing reflections off the subject. It'll remove them off a car that's got the sun on it. It'll remove them off the surface of a lake and so on. And I don't use these all the time, but I do use them when I find that I'm going to get some great value from doing that. So here's an example. I hope you can see it. The image on the left has little diffused highlights on all the leaves. It was raining in this forest, so it has reflections from the cloudy sky on every leaf because they're wet, and so the sky is reflecting in those leaves. But or I should say, when I added my polarizing filter, as you can see here on the right, it eliminated those reflections from the leaves, and you have a much more saturated look to the image, and subsequently, I think it looks better. But like I say, it doesn't look great in every situation, so that's something you definitely want to think about before you do too much here. Now here's another set of pictures, and there's a few things I like about this, and there's a few things I don't. If you look at the image on the left, the trees are really kind of flat, but I love the waterfall and the rocks. Now look what happens to the image when I add the polarizer on the right. All the green looks fabulous, but look at how the polarizer took the reflections out of the water, and it looks like what I call these days the bad HDR effect. So I'm not so sure that there's a win-win for me here by using the polarizing filter to then remove all the reflections in the water. I like the water in the left image better. What I would probably do in this case, though, is I would probably do two shots, because now I understand Photoshop very well. I would do two shots. I would do the left image for the water, and I'd do the right image for the foliage, and then I would blend the two exposures in Photoshop to basically get the look that I want. So polarizers are a good thing to have. Another filter that can be quite useful is the neutral density graduated filters. Here I've used the blue filter that I have on the right. I do have a graduated neutral density in sky blue that is great for situations like on the left here, where the sky is kind of a little bit hazy and from clouds and stuff like that, and it made it look much more blue on the right side, and I like that better. And so that's one reason to get them, or simply just to darken a sky that might be really bright when compared to your foreground. They work pretty good for that. And as you know, or you may know, or you may not know, you can create the same effect in Lightroom and Photoshop and processing software now, so having the filter may not be a big deal. Here's another example of where I used a neutral density filter to bring down the sky to be a closer match to the reflection in the lake. So I was pretty happy with the effect of using a neutral density filter here. But again, if you understand Photoshop and exposure blending, you can do all this you can do all this on the computer, and you don't have to worry about doing it in the field. Another filter that I've carried around from time to time is what's called a sunset filter. And here, this is not a forest fire, even though that's what everybody thinks. I am very high up in the mountains, and there's a storm kind of down in the valley. The clouds are coming in across the valley, they're hitting the mountain that I'm on, and then they're swirling up in the air. Then, as it became closer to sunset, the sun was shining through these clouds. It was actually under the clouds and shining through them. And I added the sunset filter and was shocked when I got these bright red fire-looking pictures back. So that was kind of fun. So anyway, interesting use of a sunset filter, but I kind of quit using a sunset filter because I just don't need photographs that are entirely orange. You can get a graduated sunset filter to make your sky look more like a sunset, but I've really started doing those things in Photoshop just to kind of avoid things looking too fake anymore. So, but that's how this was created, and it was pretty amazing. So the next thing we're going to talk about is depth of field. So what is it? Well, it's described as the point in front and behind the subject that is deemed to be an acceptable focus. So every time you focus on a subject, there is a certain area in front of the subject that's going to be in focus, and behind it that's going to be in focus as well, and that's depth of field. Here's a chart. This is a rough chart for the most part, but there's the camera, and it's focused on the person standing there. The point where you focus, where your autofocus point hits a subject and focuses on them, is called the focal point. Then there's an area in front of them and an area behind them that is in what's called that acceptable focus. Usually, roughly, it's about 1/3 in front and 2/3 behind. But I found that the closer I get to a subject, it becomes more 50-50. So don't consider that a hard rule of thumb. But consider it when you are setting up to photograph a subject, just how you go about focusing on them and what kind of depth of field you're going to apply to them. So here's some examples. These flowers on the left are very, very shallow depth of field, very narrow depth of field. There's not much depth of field, so to speak. It works very, very well for making the flowers stand out. But on the right side, this is Death Valley, and here there is maximum depth of field, meaning everything I can see in the foreground all the way to the background is very sharp. So we often just look at this as shallow depth of field or maximum depth of field. But, of course, there are other depths of field. So why does depth of field matter? Well, because what we see with our eyes does not necessarily translate to the photographs we want to create. You know, when you think about it, our eyes have an infinite depth of field, and the camera does not. Another thing when we're looking at photographs is our eye tries to avoid things that are out of focus. And so you can actually use your depth of field to force the viewer of your photograph to look at the subject you want them to look at. Shallow depth of field really forces the eye to focus on the part of the scene that is in focus, while maximum depth of field places importance on the entire scene. And the other thing about depth of field is it is a fabulous tool for creativity, and I'll show you a few more examples. Now here's an example just to kind of give you an idea of what I'm talking about here. The lupin flowers, it's the same shot for the most part. There's a little bit of more space above the flower on the left than there is on the right. But the image on the left is pretty much a wide open aperture at about f4. My lens is a 2.8, but it's about f4. While on the right, I'm down to about f16. You can see completely different effects here. The image on the left, of course, really sort of isolates the flower, makes it stand out, while the picture on the right is more just kind of a jumble of lupin flowers. So that's one example just to kind of give you an idea of what how depth of field can be used. Now here's another example of cactus in the desert. The image on the left is I'm focused out there by those acacia, which is that tall thing going into the sky, that tall desert plant, and look at the foreground cactus. It's very disturbing. Now we have a much greater depth of field in the image on the right. The flowers in front are in focus as well as the background. It's a whole different feel to the photograph, and it's a lot more peaceful, while the left side is much more disturbing of a look when it comes to how much depth of field you should apply to your subject. So what controls the amount of depth of field you have? Well, there's really pretty much three things here. The lens to the subject distance is the first one. The aperture or f-stop that you set your lens to is the second controlling factor of depth of field. And then the focal length of your lens, like wide angle versus telephoto. So let's look at the camera to subject distance first. Here you can see I'm using, in this diagram, a 50 millimeter lens at f8. When I'm focused on the subject at 10 feet, the depth of field is 6 feet to 9 feet. But when I double the distance of the subject from the camera to 20 feet, the depth of field increases to 12 feet, from 12 feet to 50 feet. So you can see that the farther the subject is from the camera, the more depth of field I have at exactly the same settings. And it's going to work the other way. If I pulled the subject, or let's say I moved the camera closer to the subject like 5 feet, you can pretty much expect that the depth of field is going to be much less, maybe 3 feet to 4.5 feet or something like that. It's often said that wide-angle lenses have much more depth of field than a telephoto lens. In fact, I say it all the time. Wide-angle lenses are easier to get more depth of field. So here is the same subject from the camera distance of 10 feet, but I got a 28 millimeter lens, and you can see that my depth of field is 5 feet on the front side, all the way to infinity on the back side. So yes, a wide-angle lens can be perceived as having more depth of field. Now let's take a look at how your aperture affects depth of field. The smaller your aperture, the more depth of field. So again, 50 millimeter lens focused at 10 feet. When I'm at 5.6, my depth of field is f8 to 12, and you can see f11 goes 7 feet to 17 feet, and at f22, 5.5 feet to infinity. Now, as you can see, this is not so much the 1/3, 2/3. It's already changing. It might be more like 1/4 in the front and 3/4 in the back. Hard to say. But my point is that the smaller your aperture, the more depth of field you're going to get. Now, let's go back to that wide-angle lens has more depth of field concept. And this is back to the 28 millimeter lens, also focused at 10 feet. Look what happens here. f5.6, 6 feet to 29 feet. But by the time you get to f11, 4 feet to infinity, we didn't get there with the 50 millimeter lens. We didn't get to infinity until we were at f22 with the 50 millimeter lens. But here at f11, 4 feet to infinity, and f22, 2.7 feet to infinity. Now you can see why wide-angle lenses are so popular when you're shooting, say, that field of flowers and the mountain on the horizon. It just gives you so much more depth of field. Now, most cameras, although not all, have a depth of field preview button that allows you to push that button in and actually look through your viewfinder of your camera and see your depth of field. Admittedly, if you're set to f22 and you push that button in, you're now looking through that tiny hole of f22, and it's going to take some time for your eye to adjust to the lower light level to actually see your preview, for the most part, how much depth of field you have. So I don't do this very often, to be perfectly honest. Now there's a thing called hyperfocal distance. What is it? Well, it's the closest point of focus at a given aperture at which infinity falls within the depth of field. Now, in the previous diagram, I showed you that infinity was available at many f-stops when the 28mm lens, for example. And so for you to get infinity to fall just inside of your depth of field, where do you focus to get to that? So here's a simple diagram. Well, maybe not so simple, but here's a diagram just to sort of give you an idea. So you got a 50mm lens at f22. The red bar indicates the focal point. So in the top here, you see the camera, some flowers, and a mountain. Okay. When focused on infinity, right below the mountain is the infinity mark where the orange bar is. When focused on infinity, this 50mm lens at f22, closest depth of field is 12 feet. Well, look what's happening here. The flowers are at 10 feet. So the flowers will not be in focus when the lens is focused on infinity. So go to the next section right below there, focused on the flowers. The depth of field becomes 10 feet to 48 feet. So now the flowers are in focus, but the mountain is out of focus. That's because I'm focused very close to the camera here. And because of that sort of 1/3, 2/3 that I mentioned earlier, infinity is not available, but 48 feet is. And the mountain, of course, is miles and miles away, so it's not going to be in focus. So the way you deal with a situation like this is you use what's called the hyperfocal point. And that often can be an imaginary point, but it's actually the point that you have to focus on, even if there's no subject to focus on, that's going to extend your depth of field to the max. So at the very bottom bar, you can see that the camera has infinity on the right and 6.3 on the left when this 50mm lens at f22 is focused on 13 feet. So how do you determine this? Well, the easiest way is to use a hyperfocal chart that will help you figure out how much depth, where you need to focus to get maximum depth of field for your lens. And that's going to be, it's going to vary by lens, it's going to vary by aperture, and it's going to vary by lens focal length. So that's a lot of charts to carry with you. Here's one, for example, in a place that you can download them, and kind of gives you an idea of where you need to focus to get maximum depth of field. And by the way, it does matter which sensor size your camera has, small versus full frame. So that's an important consideration. But you can get these charts, as you can see here, at sfcc.edu, photography, downloads, hfcharts.pdf. Or you can do what I did. You can go get the Simple Depth of Field app for your smartphone off of iTunes, and this will calculate it all for you. So much easier, way to go. So now let's just kind of look at different focal lengths. Let's look at different depth of field just to kind of give you an idea of how you might approach some of your subjects. Here we have f2.8, I'm laying on the ground, looking up through ferns, very, very shallow depth of field. I'm looking up through the forest, so that's the spots of lights and that sort of thing. And of course, much more interesting from the standpoint than if I had actually had a small aperture with max depth of field. Here's another one, wheatgrass, and it's off to the side, and I'm focused right on it and using a narrow depth of field to try to keep the background really out of focus. But as you'll also notice, some of the wheatgrass is out of focus a little bit too. Here's another example of some frosty leaves out in the mountains. On the left is maximum depth of field, but on the right is a very shallow depth of field. I don't remember the apertures. I should have written them down, but or looked at the files. But it's more of an example of maximum depth of field on the left. All the leaves are sharp, and the background has a lot of definition and shape to it. But then when I opened up my aperture, the background becomes a sort of pastel color background, which is really, really cool. But you will notice the leaves in the back of this are starting to fall out of focus. Is that a problem? I think it's open to interpretation as to whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. So I'm not too concerned about it. And it's a good example of depth of field. Now let's just take a look at different shots and how I interpreted these as to what type of depth of field they really needed. Here, why would you want only some of these flowers in focus when you're shooting kind of wide angle versus all of them in focus? And so, anywhere from 16, 22 to 32 is going to get everything in focus for the most part. And that's what you want in a scene like this. And I feel the same way about this shot from Death Valley. I want everything in focus, and as such, I use a very small aperture. Here I'm on the ground looking up through these flowers with a fisheye, and it's another perfect example of wanting maximum depth of field. I see no reason to have the flowers at the top of the picture more or less in focus than the ones at the bottom of the picture. I want it all in focus. So, and the same here. Everything that's seen in this picture is important, so why not keep it all in focus and use a small aperture? Then we're going to have scenes that are more shallow depth of field, or what I call moderate depth of field. You can start looking at them going, well, what aperture do I really need for this? Well, here's a perfect example. There's some depth here. There's what I call scene depth that is here, but does it require f/22 to get it all in focus? Because I'm a fair distance away shooting at around 150 to 160 millimeters. So do I need f/22 and a slower shutter speed? I don't think so. So here, f8 to f11 would work fine. This is a macro shot looking down. Now there is depth to this scene. So you do want enough depth of field to kind of keep things in focus here from the left and right and top to bottom and so on. But do you need f/22 to get it all? I don't think so. Again, I'm around f11 in this case. So, I've talked about wide-angle lenses having more depth of field, but here's proof that they necessarily don't. 15 millimeter, well, okay, this is not proof that they don't have as much depth of field. It's proof that you need to watch where you put that hyperfocal point. This is a 15 millimeter fisheye at f, and I focused on the needles at the back of the cactus. And you can see the background in the left picture. The background is showing as being pretty out of focus. But, everything in the foreground, these flowers, looks great. And so, again, depth of field is still going to work the same, even with a fisheye lens, in putting your focal point on the best spot, but also using the correct aperture for the scene depth and getting everything in focus when you want it in focus. So then you're going to have what I call depth of field, who cares? And very one-dimensional scene here on the ground with some leaves and stuff like that. And you don't need much depth of field to get this to be pretty well all sharp. f8 would be probably perfect, but you might even be able to do it with something like f5.6. So, and another example of who cares? Just as long as you're in focus, and it's a very one-dimensional subject. It's not going to require a small aperture. So this is the type of thing you can shoot handheld with a pretty wide aperture. So, all right, let's move on to composition. Just what is that? Well, it's the pleasing selection and arrangement of subjects in one's picture area. Photographic composition is an expression of your natural sense of design. So what's important really is to look for ways to give the center of interest in your picture the most attention. And I call it by, basically using visual depth or scene depth to sort of create strong compositions. Now, if you've been reading up on composition and practicing it, you're well aware of the rule of thirds. And this is for a landscape horizontal photo. And you basically divide your frame in thirds, both left and right and vertically. And where each of those lines crosses is what they often call hotspots, compositional hotspots. So we're going to look at some pictures here and just sort of give you an idea of how composition has been applied to these. So here is back to that reflection. Well, you've got the clouds on the left third and you've got the forest on the right third. So it is a compositional element that's been applied to this. For this lighthouse, I put the light pretty much in what we call that compositional hotspot, and it gives it breathing room. There are a lot of subjects, and I have some coming up, where centering the picture works just fine, and it's a matter of your design and your design ability and your taste and how you want things to look that's most important. But I really feel strongly that even the most powerful images that I see all the time do incorporate some of these really basic compositional elements. Here's sort of a 1/3, 2/3 in a way, but also the water down below is in what I would call the 1/3 hotspot, so it's a different take on it. Another waterfall sort of has the waterfall in the 1/3 on the right and 2/3 on the left, even though not perfectly accurate in that respect, but again, to give you an idea. This is from Georgia, and again, 1/3 sky, 2/3 the foreground, and the reason is the sky, or the distance with the trees, is not that interesting to give it more attention. The foreground is much more interesting, so limit the amount of the top of your picture, or the sky, or the horizon, or anything, based on how interesting it is. This is the Grand Canyon, and I can kind of look at this as a 1/3, 1/3, 1/3, sort of give an equal importance to the layered sections of the canyon, but also notice that the peak in the foreground, which has got a famous name that I can't think of at the moment, it's kind of placed in a 1/3 hotspot. So, very effective. And then here's a really nasty storm coming when I was traveling through Oklahoma. The sky was why I stopped to take a photograph. And as you can see, I gave it more weight by giving it 2/3 of the composition, and the grass, or the field, about 1/3. And then I kind of processed it in Photoshop, saturating it a little bit. Another compositional element is lines. Lines can be a very powerful element of your overall composition, and so again, we'll look at some examples of using lines to create interest. In this particular picture, there's just a hint of the tree on the right side, and I have various versions of this. Some of them have more of the tree, creating more of a 1/3 on the right side. This one I happen to like because of the lines, which is why I'm showing it, that in the background they just kind of keep, they're going up towards the sky. And it creates a lot of interest, and that is basically the star of the photograph for the most part, is those trees sitting amongst the fog. Another kind of example of lines is these aspen tree trunks, and just masses of them. But again, when I frame this up, as much as I like all the lines, notice that the tree trunk with the biggest tree trunk is kind of in a 1/3 spot from the right side of the picture. So I think that helps a lot. Now this is one that's got really good composition. This has been one of my better performing photographs, you might say. It's got lots of lines in the background, but it's also got some 1/3s going on in the red, and then above the red and below the red. Again, not exactly 1/3s, but you can see where I'm coming from with how there's multiple compositional elements. And then the fir tree on the left side is exactly in a 1/3 line, and so this balances out really, really nice. This is Yellowstone after the 1988 fires. I went back there in '89 to photograph what was a massive explosion of wildflowers in the forest, but I captured all these dead and tree trunks that were burned out. So what we got going on here is we got lines, we got a little bit of 1/3, 2/3 kind of thing, and then the tree trunk in the foreground on the left is sort of in a 1/3 spot. So again, it's sort of the lead-in element, and then our eye continues past that through the scene. Receding lines are another very strong compositional element, and there's so many things you can work into this type of composition. There's many ways of incorporating these types of lines in your composition, and other people use different names for them. I'm going to just show you what I call them, and you can, as you further learn, you can call lines anything you want. But here the power lines are coming in from one side. They're a lot bigger, and they slowly recede into the distance. So to me, these are perfect receding lines, and with phenomenal light as the sun is setting to the left out of the picture. Here is a roadway that is also a receding line, but also probably fits in more to what we call the S-curve type of thing, but again, coming out of the corner and heading off into the distance. This is Idaho, and this is definitely receding lines, again, coming out of the foreground. These lines lead the viewer to the mountains, which are the star of the photograph. Now, some people would probably call this receding lines as well, but I call this forced perspective. This is a situation where the foreground demands that you follow the lines through the pictures. And to me, forced perspective really works best when it comes out of the left and the right corners at the bottom of your composition and guides the viewer through the picture. This could be a road, it could be railroad tracks, it could be a lot of different things, but here really the viewer is forced to follow what you put in front of them. And so that's why I call this forced perspective. This is sort of the same thing from Death Valley. Again, we don't have two lines, we only have one line, but it's almost a forced perspective type of an approach. From Utah, I was enthralled with these lines at sunset, and so I shot away. And again, these lines really grab you, pull you to the horizon, so to speak. Keep an eye out for textures and patterns as well. This is just mud along a riverbank up in Alaska, and it's kind of interesting. And, you know, I do, when I shoot textures, try to keep other elements of composition in there. Sometimes I'm able to get them in, sometimes I'm not. But again, keep an eye out for this type of stuff, as well as, you know, this is the beach and sand patterns, and there is no lines, leading lines, no forced perspective, anything like that. It's just kind of an interesting pattern. And so I have, actually I have more sand coming up. This has been a picture of mine that's been published a number of times, and again, there's not really anything here except a great big pattern. But when I was framing this up, I was spending a lot of time looking at it. So as you'll notice in the upper right corner, there's that red. That's kind of close to a 1/3 hotspot, so to speak, as well as the green, darker trees up there. That's above the 1/3 spot, but it was the best I could come up with balancing, because below I was going to get a road, and above I was going to get the sky, and I didn't want either of those. So it's the best compromise of compositional elements and a really good pattern shot. So I don't know what you think about this. I guess you could call this a pattern shot too, because it's a repeating pattern of alligators at an alligator farm. So had a little fun with this. I did not step in the ring, so to speak, to capture it. Here's another example of patterns, and again, when I look at this type of thing, I am rotating the camera, I'm getting down lower, coming up higher, trying to sort of fill the frame with interest, including things like this white area right here that I put sort of in a 1/3 hotspot with some other gaps between the cracked mud, and then the corners are filled in a little bit more with tighter cracks and so on. So it's, you know, I don't just lean over and happy snap this. I am really working the camera to try to come up with even the strongest pattern, so to speak, for a composition. And this is another example. I worked this image for quite a while, getting a little lower, getting a little higher, trying to make sure that I didn't have any black holes that would need to be filled, so to speak. So trying to really fill it from section to section with some good color and patterns from these leaves without too many dark holes, like you see in the upper corner. There's a little bit of one, but not enough to be a problem. So I was rotating the camera to include those leaves up there to ensure that I didn't really get too much of a black hole there, so to speak. So, and then again, repeating patterns. This is on the beach again, and it's what I call the sand forest. And, I think it's interesting. So keep an eye out for this type of stuff. So framing, another compositional element, is a way to use a frame of some kind in nature around the star of your photo. Here the star is Devil's Tower in Wyoming. And I'm in the campground camping, and I decided, I thought the light was great, so I'm just going to try to frame it with some tree branches. And these are the only ones I could find that really would accommodate what I wanted to do. But you can see it works pretty good, and it's better than just I also have the tower with just blue sky, not near as much impact as this one has. This is from Arches, and it's the north window, and I'm actually looking through the window beyond at something else. So you can look at this as a frame, but it's also a window that takes you further into the scene. Now, I have this shot like you see it here, but I also have it of just the window with the other arch in the background, meaning I zoomed in a little bit. And that's probably an even better example of framing, by using the window to sort of pull the viewer through the window to what's in the background. Another example of framing, and this is a section of Mesa Arch in Canyonlands National Park, and it's another very powerful approach to framing the subject right as the sun is rising. And then finally, as far as framing, here is looking down through maple leaves at the river down below and capturing a section of it, and it worked very well. So normally you might not see this type of thing until you really force yourself to look hard, look at things, look through things, walk around them, try different angles, and so on. There's another thing that I think can be considered a compositional element, although not everybody agrees with me, but color, I think, can be a compositional element. It can either be by itself, or you can include other compositional elements to create a strong and powerful composition. This image has been successful from a publishing standpoint, and it's really just color and some sort of twisty, windy branches and so on. So, I let my clients decide how great my photos are based on when they send me a payment for the use of one. So this one has done pretty well. So again, keep an eye out for color. Here's another example of color. If you were to convert this to black and white, would you have as much of an exciting picture without the color? So here the red makes the flowers stand out from the blue and the greens in the background. And so it's kind of why I say, I think color can be considered compositional. And a field of lupin. I mean, why do we have white lupin amongst what's purple-blue otherwise? I don't really know. But again, here I'm using not only the color as a composition, but I'm using sort of the 1/3 hotspot as an option as well. Then lines and colors, and you could even probably call this patterns and textures. I think this image has worked pretty well for including a lot of ingredients. And you've got your whites, you got your greens, you got your oranges, some browns, and so on. And subsequently, this is a pattern that's very chaotic in a lot of ways, but I'm looking at it when I'm shooting it, and I'm thinking that I'm including some compositional elements. Like the aspen in the lower right is on close to the 1/3 line. There's the gap. On the left is the green tree, also kind of roughly 1/3, and then lines kind of filling in the rest of it, combined with color tones. So lots of ways to do it, but I think it's a good example. Don't overlook light and dark compositions, or what can also be considered to be negative space. This is not so much negative space, but this is definitely a silhouette, light tone, and a dark tone, and it works very, very well. Here is Bruneau Dunes in Idaho, and lots of negative space. I'm using the leading lines coming from the corner, taking us up to a 1/3 hotspot where the peak of the dune sits, and then the sun has set behind, and I converted it to black and white, and as a result, it's got a lot of negative space in it, and that can kind of support the rest of the scene as well. This might be an even better example of negative space. I just kind of crawled under a big old pedestal rock with, this is Arches National Park, pedestal rock with the tower in the background, and I metered on the tower in the background for good exposure, and then in Photoshop, there was a little detail in the black of the overhang, so I forced that to black. I wanted to create negative space that makes you go look at what I want you to look at, which is the tower back there. And so another way of creating an interesting photo other than just blue sky. So now there's all this talk about never center your subjects. Well, I don't believe that. I believe there are some subjects that absolutely only work if you've centered them, and this is one. Left and right, there's equal balance for the most part. You're focused just on the subject by itself, and it works very, very well. When you go to this picture, I centered this, what's called a cannonball creation, up in Theodore Roosevelt National Park, and by centering it, I'm forcing all the interest to that rock. But if you look closely here, there's other compositional elements. There's the S-curves. Almost in the lower left corner and the lower right corner, there is an eroded line that is going past the concretion up towards the wall. So there's two competing S-curves that sort of face each other. Then if you want to look at the wall behind, that's sort of a 1/3 coming down from the top. So this picture works very, very successfully with a variety of compositional elements included, as well as what some people call breaking the rules, which was centering a subject. But in my opinion, all of the other elements support this rock sitting there in the center of the frame. So try them all. Another thing to consider when you are using these compositional elements is to look at the need to create visual depth. If you look at this picture, there's the green is right in your face in the foreground, and the waterfall's way back there in the background. This gives you the illusion that there is, actually it's not an illusion, this gives you the perception there's a lot of distance from where the camera is to the background. This is called scene depth. Use your tools to create good scene depth. You can do this generally with a wide-angle lens, but there's other ways to do it if you include compositional elements. This here is one way. I'm next to one fishing boat with all these floats that kind of come from the left side, and they drop down and almost point to the other boat. And this has great visual scene depth and a very strong photograph. Here's some flowers that are really in a big bunch right next to the camera, and then little bits of them go into the upper left corner and the upper part of the photograph. So again, you've got an S-curve here if you look at the lower left of the bunch in front and follow that line as it winds its way in the shape of a backwards S to the upper left corner. This is creating good scene depth. Now on this next one here, kind of the same thing. The lines in the dunes are pulling you through the picture to the background, so it has some good scene depth. Now this is a different approach. This is a battlefield in Tennessee, actually, and by getting in close with a wide-angle lens and this broken cannon as part of the Civil War battlefield National Park, really fills the right side of the picture, but notice that the cannon in the background is in a 1/3 hotspot. This is a really powerful approach. Something big in the foreground, something strategically placed in the background. All of this type of stuff is so important to your compositions. So how do you go out into the field and find that killer shot? Well, I really think it starts with exploring, and exploring very, very aggressively. I call it shoot the ordinary, but pursue the extraordinary. So shoot the ordinary in an extraordinary manner is really probably a better way to say it. You know, I carry around a viewing card, which I used to be able to buy these in cardboard to to mount my 4x5 slides to for viewing purposes. Well, they don't make them anymore because hardly anybody shoots 4x5 film anymore. But so I went to the store and I bought a notebook, a spiral notebook that kids would take to school, and it has a black vinyl cover. I cut the vinyl cover off, and I created a 2x3 hole in it to accommodate the format of my digital cameras. And then I'll walk around and I'll hold it up and I'll look at scenes and visualize my framed picture with this viewing card. And it's an effective way to learn how to see when you're in the field. And subsequently, I can recommend that you do that. Don't set your camera up and look through it and go, oh yeah, that's cool, I'll take a picture. Preview your photograph, go, wow, I love that. Then set up your camera to basically duplicate what you saw with the viewing card. Here's a good example of being kind of caught off guard and not expecting to see anything. It was a foggy day. I'm at a battlefield. I think I'm in Kentucky, shooting a battlefield in the fog. And this old guy walks by with his dog, and I was done shooting, and I walk out the car, and I look down the road, and I spot this, and it was like click, 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 click. And actually, it wasn't that many clicks. I only got 2 frames off before he disappeared into the fog. So this is what I call really, really lucky. And then I kind of did sort of an eerie Photoshop processing on it. My point is, be observant of everything that is around you. And here's another example of being observant. This is a workshop I was teaching in Grand Staircase years ago, and the student found this little tiny pool of water and subsequently framed up some really nice reflections. And so again, if you aren't paying attention or aren't exploring different vantage points, you can miss some stuff like this. So that's why I always say, get up high, get down low. This is the same wheat field as the previous photo, but I'm down on my knees. So you just never know. This is the Smoky Mountains. Again, where we were shooting, this was the only brilliant, bright red color at the day we were there. And as such, I headed right for it, but it just didn't make that great of a composition from above. But once I got down really low, put my camera almost down to the ground and started looking up, that's when I came across this really nice pattern. Notice how well it's balanced on the left and right. Lower left corner's green, lower right corner's green, but the red fills in almost everywhere else of the picture. So again, keep an eye out. Get down low, get up high. Also, consider zooming in and zooming out. Here is Mesa Arch in Utah, and here is Mesa Arch in Utah as well when I zoomed in. And again, this is a very popular location. When I first went here, there wasn't a soul. And now if you go down there just about any time of the year, you're going to be standing shoulder to shoulder with other photographers all wanting the same shots. So, but it's worth going and trying to get. I'll tell you what you can do to not have any people there is go during a major snowstorm and then wait for the snowstorm to break, and you'll be there probably by yourself, and it'll be magical. So I also always try to shoot horizontals and verticals because you just never know how it might be used. Another technique I think is interesting is what I call isolate and illustrate. On the left here, we have a detail of mud. This mud can be from anywhere. This is an isolated subject. But on the right side is also cracked mud from Owens Valley in California. And this is an illustrative approach to composing my scene. The reason is it tells a story. It's cracked mud in a desert location, and there's mountains in the background. Gee, I'll bet you that's California, or maybe that's Colorado. But it tells you so much more than the isolated subject. Back to these lupin again. Okay, isolated flower on the left. These lupin could be growing anywhere that lupin grow. But when you look at the image on the right, it tells more of a story. It's in the forest. It's somewhere. Who knows where? Another thing I think about photographing and getting exceptional pictures is to ask yourself, before you take a picture, why am I going to take a picture? Something like, why do I love these sand patterns? Why do I want to take a picture? Well, the answer most likely is going to be because it's a beautiful texture and it looks like a forest, which is, of course, this picture that I just showed a few minutes ago. it's kind of helpful to ask yourself why you are going to take a photograph other than just, oh, I don't know, it looks kind of cool. Because if you can answer why you want to take the picture, you're going to be working hard from within your brain on how you're going to go about photographing it. It's more than just, oh, I think it's kind of cool. I think it's kind of cool because of this. And that means you're already working your subject to figure out exactly why you are going to photograph it. So here's some questions. What do I want to include in the frame? What should stand out or dominate the composition? What's the best angle? How much depth of field is needed? What should the shutter speed be? What about the light? How does it look? Okay, these are the things that you want to ask yourself mentally while you're working a scene, because then when you ask yourself, you're observant of every one of the key ingredients that goes into making a strong composition. So here's an example. Who's the star? Well, obviously it's the rock, and the lines of the eroded formation here almost kind of lead to the rock and take your eye up there. What's the star of the photo here? Well, obviously it's the sand dunes in the distance with a good foreground that's lit really nicely with the setting sunlight. What's the star here? Well, it's obviously these blooming cactus in the foreground, but the elements in the back of the picture, the saguaros and the yellow flowers, are what I call supporting actors in the scene, or supporting elements. You have a star of the photo, which is the cactus, and supporting actors in the background. Here, it's much more simple. There is the flower, and then there's a simple background. And this is strong as well. It's obvious what the star is. Okay, let's move on to light. Andreas Feininger was a photographer in the very early days of photography and wrote a lot of books on photography. But his favorite quote for me is, there's no such thing as bad light, just light that's not used properly. Or I'm paraphrasing him, just light that's used improperly. And so this, again, is really, really what it's all about. Light is essential to good photography. Light shapes the land and your subject. So to get really good at mastering light, you need to watch your subjects and see how the light is affecting them. Just because you found a great subject doesn't mean it's going to be a great photo if the light is bad. Here's an example. What we're going to do now is we're going to look at different times of day and how the quality of light is during those times of day. It's the Grand Canyon at sunrise, and of course the lighting contrast is what I call moderate. It's not super high contrast, but I consider it to be much more moderate. This is also sunrise on the East Coast, and the contrast again is a little higher than the previous photo, but I would still consider it to be pretty moderate. But then from the Arizona desert, I consider this to be a higher contrast scene, even though it's still early. Actually, this is sunset, not sunrise. I miswrote that. But anyway, the sun is setting and the contrast is a lot higher here, but that's what's making it work. There's not a lot of shadow. There's a lot of highlight, but the shadow's got a lot of detail in it and stuff like that. So, and again, nice golden sunset and really, really nice. But again, pretty high in contrast. But the color is what really makes it. So if you're wondering how that color works, early in the day, the sun, really early or late in the day, the sun has much more atmosphere to go through, and that's what really warms the color of the light up, is the stuff that's in the air. I hate to say it, but if there's a forest fire way far off or a lot of air pollution, the light can be really, really good. But we don't want that. As the sun gets higher in the day, it's got less atmosphere and it becomes a lot bluer. So then after sunrise, the contrast is still, there's more contrast, but the color is lost. This, I believe, was about an hour to 2 hours after sunrise, and yet the light is still perfect for the sand dunes here in New Mexico, but there's still a lot of contrast, but the color is gone. Just because the color is gone and it's getting later in the morning doesn't mean that the light is bad. So by no means should you stop shooting. You should just pay attention to your subject and how the light at that time is affecting it. And then here's another example of light midday that doesn't work very well. The color is gone. This is the Badlands in South Dakota. The color is gone. The light is very blue and very contrasty, and it doesn't help that there's backlighting, which is creating even more shadow. But midday doesn't necessarily mean all is lost. This is Glacier National Park, and the sun is probably more about 11 in the morning. And this picture has been published a few times, and it's a good example that, well, it isn't over until it's over, or even better, all light is good light, depending on how you use it. So don't stop shooting just because it's midday. Just make sure you find subjects that work really, really well for that time of day. And of course, then there's flat, overcast light, which is a great time to shoot. But when you got a white sky, I don't go do the big landscapes when I got a white sky. I look for the more intimate details, or I'll go into the forest or something like that, where sunny light or sunlight is terrible in a forest. In some situations, it creates too much contrast. So I'll head into the forest on overcast days, and then I can get, conditions like this. Fog in the lighthouse, perfect timing. Here you can see there's hardly even any blacks in the scene because of the fog, but it's very cool. Again, another one from the Yellowstone fire, and an overcast day, and much, much better conditions to work in. I haven't been here when this has been in the sun, but again, this could be pretty magical if you had some sun. But I'm very thrilled that there is, and actually this is not an overcast day. This is the shade. So again, take note of that. Going into the shade can bring you some magical subjects that work really, really well in that flat light. And an overcast day, again, makes this waterfall incredible, and perfect time to go. But then you got the sun and you got backlighting. Well, again, backlighting can be very harsh, or I should say backlighting is very harsh and contrasty. But again, you don't have to put the camera away. Just find subjects that are going to work really well. Another example, the sun is about to set here on a photo workshop I was teaching once. Very high in contrast, but again, it's working very well. Now, this is kind of an interesting shot. This is the sun's about to set, so there's still a lot of contrast, but also the contrast is moderating a little bit. There's detail in the shadows here, even with the sun shining into the lens. That's not easy to do in most cases, but the reason it's working is because the sun, I purposely positioned the camera so that the sun is sort of peeking around the tree. That's going to lower the contrast a little bit and help get a good capture of a full dynamic range with highlights and shadows having detail. This is another example of exactly the same technique, waiting for the sun to start going behind a cloud, and it lowered the contrast. Okay, let's talk about exposure coming up here. So the first thing is, when it comes to exposure, it's really about interpretation. Your camera can do whatever you tell it to do. It's understanding what to tell your camera to do. So this is basically a grayscale chart, black on one end, white on the other end. And it's just really an example to kind of give you an idea. But right smack in the middle, halfway between black and white, is what's called 18% gray. These are the Kodak gray cards. Same color as you see with this, and the gray that goes around the grayscale in this frame here is 18% gray. If you were to use a gray card and meter off of it while you're in the field, you'd get a perfect exposure as long as the light that's hitting your landscape is also hitting the card. You'd get a perfect exposure. That's what the camera's job is. Take all the tones of a scene, sort of calculate how much quantity of each of those tones is in the picture, and then recommend an exposure, or if you're using automatic shooting modes like aperture priority, it'll pick it, and that's what you'll be taking your picture of. But it doesn't always work, and this is why it's really important to start understanding your exposure and how exposure works. So here's a good example. This is some sand dunes in North Carolina. And I was, again, so excited to run into this. The sun has just set to the right on the horizon there. And so I took this picture based on what the meter suggested. Well, that wasn't what I was seeing. This is what I was seeing. And this is a brighter exposure. And the sky's a little bit brighter, but the dunes are definitely brighter. And as such, this is how I interpreted the scene, giving it a little bit of an overexposure to get what I thought I was seeing. So I interpreted it. Now here's another one from Utah. This is the proper exposure for this scene based on the highlight that's hitting the rock back there. But the foreground is dark. Here's what the camera metered. The camera saw all that dark in the foreground, said, okay, here's what I recommend. But it was an overexposure, and subsequently it overexposed that rock in the background. And so again, it's interpretation. It's knowing that, whoa, that rock in the background's overexposed. What should my exposure be? And then determining it. So some tips on exposure are, first of all, you want to expose correctly right from the very beginning. And again, learn to master how to interpret the conditions of your scene. One of the worst ways is to use your LCD as the final answer for a proper exposure. I'm going to guess that in many cases, if not the majority, those files, those digital files, when using the LCD, are underexposed based on the capabilities of a histogram. So I recommend you use your histogram because it's going to allow you to capture a greater range of definition. So let's look at a couple scenes and sort of think about how you would interpret it. This is what the camera metered, but look, there's hardly any shadows. It's mostly highlight. It was a proper exposure right off the bat. But then I'm back to Mesa Arch here again, shooting into the shadow side of the subject, and now I have a whole different situation. How am I going to base my exposure for this? Well, I did some testing. I shot multiple exposures to ensure I'd get the proper exposure. But if you look through the opening here in the arch, the horizon is really kind of overexposed back there. That is a blue sky back there, but it's overexposed. And it has to be overexposed so that I can capture the detail in the shadow on the side of the arch that's closest to the camera. So again, it's interpretation, trying to get as much detail as you can for your particular scene. The easiest way to do that, in my opinion, is to use your histogram. What it is it is a scale, for the most part, that tells you where all your data is falling between black and white. It maps the tonality of your dynamic range. So one thing I want to mention first is that your LCD and the histogram is based on a JPEG, not on a RAW file. So it means that if you can get that histogram and the preview to look really, really good, you'll have more data in your RAW file. Now, the height of the histogram in various situations, you'll find some spikes, indicates basically how much of a specific level there is in your scene. But what's really most important is where you are mapping the data for a good exposure. So this is the lupin again, and it's a dark subject matter, meaning it's darker than that 18% gray tone. So as you can see, the histogram is kind of moved to the left. If you look at the histogram at the bottom here, the white part below the red, green, blue, you can see some regions, little faint lines. These are the regions of the histogram where the tones sit. On the left is black and on the right is white. In the middle would be that 18% middle gray. So as you can see, the normal exposure, or I should say what the camera recommended as an exposure here, sits below the middle tone, telling us that it's a darker exposure than, it's a darker tonality than 18% gray. So that's how it basically mapped it. When I also was photographing more lupin and I overexposed a picture a lot, and I did it on purpose, is the histogram here shows a very overexposed thumbnail image, but also if you look at the histogram, it's hit the right side of the histogram, the data has. This is called clipping. anything that hits the wall and creates that straight line, all the data that went past the wall and you can't see has been clipped or thrown away in that exposure, not captured. Now, there is a little bit of bending of the rules that I'm talking about here, but I'm not going to go into the detail other than to say that some of that data might be recoverable in a raw file. But we're just talking about getting proper exposure. So if you look at this histogram, it's way overexposed and data has been thrown away. Now the same image, the opposite direction at a different exposure, and quite a huge difference between this and the previous image, has a lot of shadows that lost some detail because it's hitting the left wall where the blacks and shadows are. So it clipped away some of the information. It's going to be hard to brighten those shadows up when this happens. And I got some solutions to that coming up. Let's look at a histogram for what can be considered a normal one. Now, this is an older version of Photoshop histogram just to kind of show you. There's no blacks and there's no whites in the histogram. And so I would go into Photoshop using some Photoshop techniques and I would stretch the histogram out to add a little more contrast. But this is a perfectly exposed picture as far as mapping it out. Nothing hits the left wall, nothing hits the right wall. Now here I have a winter shot. I purposely went into Photoshop to show you sort of an overexposure in the background where the sun is hitting the snow. It's clipping back there, and you can tell by the histogram that it's a little bit cut off. So you want to back off on your exposure there a little bit. And I'll show you what I mean coming right up. Now here's the opposite. Look at all the data's on the left side, and the rock is now a silhouette. And it's clipping, it's hitting the wall, meaning it's clipping, but it's a silhouette. Who wants detail in a silhouette? So here you don't have to worry about it. It's a good exposure for how I interpreted the subject. Now let's take a look. I don't know if you can see very well because it's a snow scene, but in the snow at the base of the trees, you're not seeing really any detail. And you can tell by the histogram that that detail is clipped. It's gone. What I did is I changed my shutter speed minus 1/3 on the shutter speed, meaning an underexposure. That would be like going from 1/4 of a second to 1/5 of a second. Look what happened to the histogram. The area that was clipped has been pulled away from the wall, and now, again, it might be a little hard to see, but trust me, there is now details of the little ripples in the snow on this very overcast day. So I preserved that highlight detail, which was the goal. So that's pretty much how to interpret the histogram on your camera to make sure that you get all the necessary detail. Now there's one more thing I'm going to talk about here, and it's what's called pixel quantity by stop. And this is the histogram here. On the right side, a 14-bit raw file can capture 8,191 levels of brightness. Then the second column on the right is 4,096, then 2,048. But if you look on the left side, 512 in a 14-bit file. So obviously the right side captures substantially more information when you photograph than the left side. So what does this mean? Well, it's what I call, and a lot of people call, exposed to the right. Purposely adjust your exposure to send the data to the right side where it's going to capture more information for you to process later on. Look at the histogram here in Adobe Camera Raw of this capture from Canyonlands National Park, in which I purposely exposed to the right. All the data is from the middle of the histogram to the highlight side of the histogram. So you're thinking, well, how does that work? Well, when you then go into Photoshop and you start stretching the sliders, pulling them out, you then create a full dynamic range image with vastly more data than if you had done the opposite with an underexposed picture and tried to brighten it up. You're better off trying to darken an overexposed looking picture than brighten an underexposed picture, because all that data that gets captured on the right side. As you can see here, take a look at those sliders and you can see how I really push contrast, the blacks and the shadows, to stretch this out and create a full dynamic range image. So it's a good strategy. Here is a capture again. Here I purposely exposed to the right. It has an overexposed, low contrast look. Then I went in and I started pulling the sliders. But here's what's interesting in this case. There's not any really true black. Very little shadows, very little dark tones, yet this is still properly processed. If you look at the histogram on the right, it does stretch all the way across the bottom, but because there's no height there, it's indicating that there's very little black and very little shadow. And as such, this is a proper processing of an image that's been exposed to the right. Here's another example. Basically, exposed to the right somewhat. It looks overexposed, but see, this is a fuller dynamic range image. You're not going to adjust very much in the exposed to the right strategy, but it's overexposed a little bit. Then I went back in and I stretched the histogram out to create a full dynamic range image. Now, the exposed to the right, I recommend you practice with that. There is no perfect solution for everything. But again, keep in mind, the more you can capture that data, the better. So now one more thing on exposure. In your camera, there's a thing called blinkies, which is also known as the highlight alert or highlight indicator. And it indicates when you're clipping highlights in your images. You don't want to do that because when you're clipping, you are basically losing that data. So here's kind of a example of clipping this shot of the skull in the snow. Where the black is, this will flash on your LCD in your camera. So read your manual if you're not aware of this, how to turn it on so that you can use that. If you see any clipping, you don't want that. Back off a little bit on the exposure, and I always do it with shutter speed in -1/3 shutter speed increments. And like I said before, that would be one quarter of a second to 1/5 of a second. And keep doing that until the blinkies go away on your LCD. And then you're going to have the best raw file to process. So, okay, finally, some of the last things here is I do a tremendous amount of bracketing in the field in one-stop increments, usually a -1, -2, +1, +2, because I like to exposure blend various images to get a full dynamic range composition. So if you look on the left here, that's the picture that's great for the foreground. If you look at the right, that's the picture that's great for the sky. But look at the foreground. Well, you can composite these or blend them in Photoshop if you bracket your exposures. For some brighter ones and some darker ones, you can go into Photoshop and create a full dynamic range image that works very, very well for creating full dynamic range images. So, learn Photoshop or something comparable. You'll be glad you did. So, anyway, let's wrap up here and get ready to head out. So the goal is, of course, to be a great photographer. And you do that by exploring the non-obvious. Look at everything that's in front of you. Look around it. As I said, get up high, get down low, and just observe. Practice, 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 and of course, get out there and shoot all the time. You want to frame your photo to force the viewer's eye to look at something in your picture. Take what you are presented with and then dig something from nothing. Create photographs rather than take pictures. I believe the ability, of course, to create those great photographs is an evolution. It's a process that develops with experience. The more you do it, the better you're going to get. And the better you get, the more happy you're going to be with the photographs you create. So, let's finish with a few photography rules. Use light that best provides a visual description of the scene. Compose the image to emphasize what in many cases can be the star of a photo. Expose the picture for the best histogram based on the scene. Don't take pictures, build photographs. And finally, remember, there are no rules. Just go have fun and create. Okay, that's a wrap on this, so we'll move on from here.